I'm going to be talking about the effects of being involved, interacting with the advanced technologies that are in the vehicle these days. The touch screens, the voice controls, the gesture controls, the heads-up displays. There's been an enormous infusion of technology into the vehicle. Oftentimes that technology is put into the vehicle without really a full vetting of whether or not it's safe to use or not. Are we good? Yeah. Well, I want to basically kind of take you through kind of three parts to my talk. The first part of my talk deals with kind of the history of driver distraction and kind of looking at from 100 years ago up till now some of the threads we see in terms of driver distraction and the advanced technologies in the car. Then I want to pivot and talk a little bit about the science of driver distraction, why our brains don't multitask like we think they do. And I'll spend a little bit of time just showing you and kind of giving you some evidence that in fact, the brain just doesn't multitask the way that, the way we'd like it to. And the last part I'd like to talk about, and I'll spend most of my time talking about, is the work we've been doing with AAA and the AAA Foundation, looking at advanced and emerging technologies and how they affect driver distraction. So first part is going to be kind of looking at the history of driver distraction, and what you see here is what the roads looked like 112 years ago in San Francisco. It was kind of a bit of a mess. You had horse-drawn carriages, you had pedestrians walking across the street, you had vehicles that were kind of just swerving back and forth, and trolley cars, and it was really chaotic. So we've actually come quite a ways from 112 years ago. Not only was it chaos, but it wasn't particularly safe. So just as an example, in New York City, one person was killed every day by a horse of one type or another, just in New York City. So it was not a safe environment. The other thing we saw was that distraction presented itself right at the get-go. People were actually crashing these vehicles as soon as they started driving them. In fact, the first two vehicles that were licensed in the state of Ohio crashed into each other. Big state, I don't exactly know how they managed to do it, but distraction clearly has been coupled with driving. It's kind of a characteristic of our inability to be able to multitask. We now kind of move forward a little bit, and in the 1930s, it's kind of a pivotal point in terms of dealing with driver distraction, because we started to introduce technology into the car that had nothing to do with the task of driving that car. Just before the radio came was the highway hi-fi, where you could listen to little record players, and that didn't work very well, as you might imagine, bouncing on the road. But it moved into the radio, put into cars, and the thing that's key about this technology is it had nothing to do with the task of driving. So we're introducing technology to entertain the driver rather than have them drive safely. And to give you an idea about how distracted driving was on the agenda 90 years ago, 5 states in the U.S. considered legislation that would have prohibited listening to that radio while the car is in motion. Now, we know that listening to the radio is not the problem that they were concerned with, but even 90 years ago, that was on the radar. At the same time that we had this technology, we had a parallel technology. Alexander Graham Bell had patented the telephone in late 1860s, 1867, I think. For the longest time, that technology was tethered to the wall. So we didn't really have any worry about people running into anything else because they could only go as far as the cord could take them. No real thoughts at all about what would happen if you tried to do this while you were driving until this gentleman, Martin Cooper, invented and patented the car phone, and he did that in 1973. It was a big, clunky device. You can imagine trying to carry that in your pocket. It wouldn't work. It dropped calls constantly. It was very cumbersome and heavy, and didn't work all that well. But it was the precursor to letting a businessman be able to do business, and that was the purpose of this, to be able to do business while you were driving. No consideration whatsoever about whether or not that was a good thing. He just married those two technologies. So now you can basically take telephonics and driving and bring them together. Today, this is the kind of device we walk around with. It's either a smartphone of one type or another. The iPhone was invented or patented or released in 2007. So it's just been really about 11, 12 years since we started to have this kind of technology. And, well, it's actually penetrated completely. So there are actually more cell phones, more smartphones in use in the United States than there are people. So just about everybody here has some kind of a smartphone like this. And calling it a phone, well, you can talk on it, but you can all do also other kinds of things. You can surf the internet, you can do email, you can interact in all kinds of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. And in fact, there are about 2.5 million apps for that phone. So that nomadic device now basically becomes a portal to anything you can do on the computer. And when you take it into the car, then basically with the wireless capabilities, anything you could have done on the computer, you can now do in your car. And with the new technology that allows Bluetooth connections or other kinds of features that allow the capabilities of that phone to be kind of paired to the car becomes an extension of the phone and an extension of the internet. So that you can do just about anything, at least in some cars, just about anything you could do on the computer, you can now do while you're driving. Just as an example, you're going to see that you have a chance to drive the Tesla. We test the Tesla in my lab, and it allows drivers on the 17-inch monitor to be able to interact with Facebook while they're driving. So we're allowing all kinds of technology that's at the driver's fingertips. And here's another example of kind of this technology in play. So this is an advertisement for BMW. Kind of shows you kind of the capabilities that your car now has inherited as it's been paired with the phone. By the way, as I play this video, see if you can detect the little disclaimer about how you should use this technology when the car's in motion.
Hey honey, my mom stopped by. We'll see you soon. Hey honey, where the are you going?
We only make one thing, the ultimate driving machine.
What you should see, if you notice here, is that on the lower part where the green is, you're going to see that the car is actually reading a message to him. And then he backs out. And in the little green scene here, they see, do not access or use this technology while the vehicle's in motion. So clearly they're actually advertising to use this types of technology while the vehicle's in motion, even though they say not to with a disclaimer. All right. Okay, hopefully any chance they're going to fix this, that would be nice. Where we are right now is basically the technology that you have is something that the concern is that this technology is addictive, at least to some people. So if the phone rings, people can't not look at it. And you may need some kind of scaffolding like you see here where the person can't actually look at their phone. And I've got colleagues who the only way they can not use their phone is to lock the phone into the trunk. And so that's one way of scaffolding. You see that now with the iPhone and the latest operating system, it will actually allow the driver to basically, all the messages will be, all the features of the phone will not be enabled while the vehicle's in motion unless you click a button saying I'm not driving. So we're now starting to see some of the technology that is that's available that actually helps to stop drivers from being distracted. So then I want to switch to the science of distraction for a second. And so I saw basically the history of distraction, and we went from basically the radio all the way to anything that can go on your phone. Now I want to look at the science of distraction and how it is that we can actually try and understand this. And to begin with, let's look at an example. This was actually sent by the folks from Car Talk a little while ago, saying here's an example of someone who's distracted. And nothing. So, what you see here is a driver who's driving down the road, reading a book, looking at his iPad, and as he's driving down the road looking at his iPad, next thing you know, well, he picks up his phone. So he's now reading a book. He's looking at his iPad or his Kindle, and he's talking on his phone. And given the law enforcement people in the room here, I'm sure you probably see much worse than this. But this is an example of, good. This is an example of kind of really complex type of distracted driving that just doesn't, basically is completely unsafe. If you think about this in terms of the science of distraction, our brains simply do not work the way we'd like them to. In this case of trying to basically multitask, we define multitasking as trying to do two separate things at the same time. One would be just the complex task of driving the vehicle, but the other would be the task of, say, reading a book or interacting with Kindle or talking on a cell phone. Two completely separate activities. We're trying to juggle or do those two things at the same time. And that turns out to be not something that works very well. One example to try and show that is to just do a little example here in the audience. So what I'd like you guys to do for a second is, as soon as I say go, I'd like you to just say as fast as you can the letters A through I, like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. You ready? Go. Okay, that took about 2 seconds. And you learned that, in first or second grade, right? I'd like you to do the same thing now, 1 through 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ready? Go. Okay, relatively simple things you've really well learned. Think, well, heck, if I got these things that are really well learned, I should be able to juggle those two together. A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, D, 4, so forth like that, right? So I want you to try this because it gives you an illustration of the kind of complexity that you see when people are trying to actually multitask while they're driving. So, ready, go. One was harder than the other, right? Right? I mean, so one was actually really difficult to do, that kind of switching back and forth, A1, B2, C3, D4 kind of thing. Well, but those are things that were really well learned. You learned your alphabet, you learned your counting really early on. It's just that switching back and forth creates all this additional mental hardware that actually, and mental overhead. And so what we can see is that really as you're trying to multitask, be it A1, B2, C3, or driving and talking on a cell phone, you're really switching attention. You're paying attention to the first task, driving, and then you're switching to the second task, talking on the phone, and switching back. When you're not paying attention to driving, and you're talking on the phone, you're just not giving any attention to the task of driving. So what happens is you get this kind of a switching back and forth, and when you're engaged in one task, anything that goes in the other task is impaired. In addition, there are switch costs, and we heard that just a little bit ago with Jennifer, that these switch costs can actually last for long periods of time, up to between 15 to 27, in some cases even longer. So not only do you have the impairments associated with using the phone and driving, but when you switch from the driving task to then trying, or some secondary tasks like texting or talking on the phone, back to driving, you get this kind of a technology hangover of sorts. And so that's actually the combination here is we just don't multitask very well. We're really just performing one task at a time and just switching attention back and forth. Despite the fact that our brains are these massive parallel computers, massive parallel neural networks that do a lot of kind of cool things, in terms of our actual behaviors, it's really just switching from one task back to the other. And you can get it. You can see lots of examples of this. Here's a quote that's been around for a while. Any man who can drive safely while kissing a pretty girl is simply not giving the kiss the attention it deserves. Anybody have any idea where that came from? Albert Einstein. So it's been around for a while. We've known it for quite a while. The distraction, the technology, we're just not very good at multitasking. In fact, most people just cannot successfully do two things at the same time. It's like this mental juggler trying to switch attention back and forth, and usually what happens is something falls in the meantime. So you just kind of not giving due attention in this particular case to the task of driving the vehicle. In fact, most people think that they're really good at multitasking. We've looked at thousands of people across the world, and only about 2% of the population are really good at multitasking. The rest of us, most of us in this room, just aren't really good at this. And so when we try and do something like text and drive or talk on a cell phone and drive, what happens is we increase the risk of being involved in a crash because we're not paying attention to the task of driving. Here's an example of how this works in terms of simple cognitive distraction. So what we see is that this is an example of a crash caught on a video camera where what happened was the driver was talking on hands-free cell phone. So his hands were on the steering wheel, or his eyes were on the road. As he's driving, he fails to notice that the lights are red. And they've been red for a while, so you can see it's not like it just changed red, but it's been red for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He approaches the light, and he's involved in a really serious crash. These are actually quite common, these kinds of distraction things. It's called inattentional blindness, where the person simply doesn't see what's right in front of them. Their eyes are on the road, their hands are on the wheel, but they just don't see something that's directly in front of them. And this is an example of cognitive distraction, where you basically have difficulty processing the information that's right in front of you. Okay, so why this matters in terms of a group like this is that this is one of the most risky activities we do on a regular basis. Motor vehicle crash is the #1 source of accidental death. Last year, or in 2016, we had 40,000 fatalities on the roadways. And what we've noticed is that for the last, probably the last 20 years, we've been seeing fatal crashes decrease. But in 2015, they spiked at the biggest level by 7%. And this was a bit like, well, is that an anomaly? But they went up again by 6% in 2016. So we're seeing an increase in fatal crashes after decades of those crashes, fatal crashes declining. Worldwide, we see that 1.25 million fatalities are associated with motor vehicle crashes. And in research that's partly done by, supported by AAA with Dan McGehee, he found that where there are videos in the cars, you could actually look at what's happening in the 6 seconds prior to a crash. 2/3 of the cases involving crashes with teens involve some kind of distraction, either talking to another person in the car, or cell phones, or the other kinds of things that would be in the car. So distractions, along with alcohol and speed and fatigue, are significant sources of overall levels of crashes. And when we've tried to understand the science of what happens in terms of distractions and mental distractions, we've worked on an acronym that is SPIDER, which stands for Scanning, Predicting, Identifying, Deciding, and Executing a Response. This is work that I did in collaboration with Don Fisher, and the little logo here was developed by Joel Feldman. And he basically took the idea that what happens when you start to use your phone to engage in a talk or do other kind of any of the complex things you could do on that smartphone, you stop scanning. You tend to stare straight ahead, so you don't look in your mirrors. You fail to make anticipatory predictions for where hazards might be. You start to become more like a novice driver than an expert driver. You get intentional blindness, where things happen right in front of you and you don't see them, like that crash I just showed you where someone drove through a traffic light. Even though their eyes were on the road, they didn't see it. You make poor decisions in terms of when to turn and other kinds of things like that. And your reaction times are slower. And so together you can think about this kind of web of kind of inattention and impairments associated with mental distraction, where people are not paying attention to to driving because they're engaged in some kind of secondary task associated with using the phone. So again, we have this. Here's an example of kind of one of these other cartoons that gives you an idea of kind of what happens in terms of the impairments associated with people who are using this kind of technology. All right. So we'll see if the audio works this time. Maybe it does. Okay. So I want to now kind of pivot. First of all, I talked about kind of the history of distracted driving. And I just talked to you just a moment ago about kind of the science and the fact that our brains just simply do not multitask like we'd like to think they do. And the last thing I want to do is I want to now talk about the work we've been doing with AAA, measuring cognitive distraction and more complex kinds of things in the vehicle. And so this little video clip, one of the nice things about working with AAA is they really are good at outreach and trying to provide kind of various kinds of informatic kinds of information that can actually help to describe the kind of research we're doing. So this is a little video clip that shows some of the research and how we're doing it, and then I'll kind of step through the various findings that we've got.
Driving today is so much safer than it was just 20 years ago, and technology has a lot to do with that. But despite advances in vehicle technology and all the conveniences it has brought with it, it's also brought some challenges.
I have been pretty distracted when I've been driving based on, well, technology.
Well, luckily we didn't get hurt or,
They're creating the cars to be your own desk with your own personal computer, and you don't need that in a car. In a car, you just need something to drive.
AAA partnered with researchers at the University of Utah to take a closer look at the technologies built into cars meant to make us safer behind the wheel, to find out if automakers are delivering on their promise.
Where we were interested in benchmarking the different activities that drivers do in vehicles, especially with a focus on cognitive distraction.
We started basically by taking the same ways of measuring workload for pilots and using those methods in the car. And we focused on cognitive distraction when your eyes are on the road and your hands are on the wheel, but you're simply not paying attention and you don't notice things right in front of you.
Multitasking is a misnomer, so people are really just switching quickly between two tasks, and usually it means that they're performing poorly on one or both tasks. That's especially true while driving, if people are trying to drive and interact with things in the vehicle.
So what we've learned from all of this is that not all vehicles implement voice technologies in the same way. Some are significantly more demanding than others. We've also learned that older drivers have a more difficult time with these voice technology than younger drivers. If you begin with a difficult system on day one, after practicing with this system for a week or so, the system is still difficult and demanding.
AAA is confident that we can find the right balance between comfort and convenience behind the wheel and the safety of those who drive and travel the roads around us.
Good policy is based on good science. Lots of things have benefits, but they may actually have high levels of risk. And so it really is something where, as a society, we need to basically decide what is an acceptable level of risk. And really that's one of the wonderful things about working with AAA is that they take our science and help to use it so that the policies are actually well targeted.
So you've got a chance to kind of see a kind of high-level snapshot of the research and some of the ways we've been studying the research. I'm going to kind of step you through some of this work. But the first part of what we try to do is say, can we measure and develop a rating scale for cognitive distraction? That when you're looking out the road, your hands are on the wheel, but you simply just don't see something in front of you. Can we actually measure that? And once we measure that, why are we seeing the problems that we're seeing? And then to what extent does even more sophisticated kinds of technology that's in the vehicle create even more problems for the driver? So the first part of the research was basically trying to develop this cognitive workload scale. We had people driving on the roads or in a simulator, and we had a number of tasks, one of which was just driving the car without any source of distraction. That was just kind of the baseline level of how much mental effort it took to drive. Then we said, well, what happens if they're driving and listening to the radio? Is that impairing? Or if they're listening to the radio, or if they're driving and listening to a book on tape, or talking to a passenger, talking on a handheld or hands-free cell phone, and then using a speech-to-text system, kind of like Siri, only the system we could build in the lab was perfect, so it didn't make any mistakes. So imagine Siri that didn't make any errors. What would that be like in terms of workload? That's kind of the perfect speech-to-text system. And then the last system we used to kind of have our rating scale that went from 1 to 5 was a memory math kind of task, kind of like balancing your checkbook while driving down the road. And no one would do that, right? I'm assuming no one here would balance your checkbook while driving down the road, right? I hope. So anyhow, otherwise you're going to basically, not have your balanced checkbook, right? So anyhow, we realized that no one would really do that, but that's the most difficult, mentally demanding thing we could think of. So we developed a scale that went from 1, which was just driving, to 5, which was like I'm mentally slammed by some cognitive activity. But all those tasks don't require the driver to take their eyes off the road or hands off the wheel. It's entirely just the mental effort of interacting with those kinds of technologies. And we did that where we used the same technology that was used to measure workload in the Apache helicopter. So we took measures of, in this particular case, how well you drove the car. We used some secondary task measures to measure, kind of to probe how much attention was being demanded by the task. We used some subjective measures that ask, how mentally demanding was a task. And then we took physiological measures. Some of the videos you probably saw, like we were collecting EEG and heart rate, so we were looking at physiological measures as well. And we pulled all those together. Either on the left part of the slide, you see someone using the technology while we're measuring their workload while they're in a simulator. And on the right side, you see that same kind of testing, but on the roads. So we're actually, in this case, in both of those situations, recording brain activity and a number of other physiological measures as they're actually driving down the road. And when we looked at this, we then had our scale. Well, one was just driving, so single task driving, that's a category 1. And our scale, doing that memory math task, that operations span task, was a category 5. Things like listening to the radio, not very distracting. So even though we were worried about that in the 30s when they had a potential legislation, it just turns out listening to radio is not a big problem. Listening to book on tape also isn't. If you talk to a passenger sitting next to you, or talk to on a handheld or hands-free cell phone, those produce the same level of distraction for the driver. It turns out, though, that one big difference between a passenger conversation and a cell phone conversation is that passenger is in the car with the driver. And so while we see that the mental workload of the driver when they're talking is the same, whether it's on a handheld or hands-free cell phone or to the passenger, when the passenger's in the car, if it's an adult, they help to compensate for that distraction. So we kind of see as the driver's distracted, the passenger will compensate, and you get this kind of oscillatory behavior. Passenger conversations are distracting, but for at least adults, we see that that's compensated for by what the passenger is doing. Except for one situation where it doesn't work. Anyone have any teenagers in the audience? Because teenagers don't compensate. They just keep talking. They don't know when to shut up. But with our perfect version of Siri, the speech-to-text system, what we saw was on our 5-point scale, that was the highest and hardest of anything we saw. We thought that was worrisome because no one yet has perfected Siri. And so even with a system that's like this personal voice assistance that's perfect, it's going to be very distracting. So some things that aren't very distracting, the talking on a cell phone, just the talking part of it has a kind of a 2.5 on our scale, and the using these personal assistants that come with your phone was a 3 on our scale. So we're already kind of seeing workload that's fairly high. When we moved to the next phase, the question was, why is talking so demanding? And so we looked at things like, what happens if you just had the messages read to you and you couldn't reply back? And then what happens if the message was read by a human as opposed to a computer? Is it the computerized speech that's causing a problem, or is it the act of speaking that's causing a problem? And then we look to say, what happens if these systems are error-prone versus not? A perfectly reliable system that if I say something, it transcribes it perfectly, or a system like I say, hey, take me home, and it takes me to Home Depot. That's a problem. And last, we looked at using Siri to try and send and receive emails and texts. And what we found here, so on the one hand, we have our single task. This is just driving without any distraction. That's category 1. Here's doing that memory math task that no one in their right mind would do. And if you look at like sending and receiving emails or short texts with a computer, that was about a 3. That's what we saw before. If you have it either read by a computer or read by a human, it doesn't matter. What this suggests is it's not the synthetic voice, it's actually the process of actually speaking. And so if you compare the listening only to listening and speaking, well, half the impairment is the act of speaking. So although we talk all the time, it takes a lot of mental resources, and if you're trying to talk, especially talking on a phone of one type or another while you're driving, the impairments you get are at least part because you're actually trying to talk, and part of it's because you're actually trying to listen. The listening part is much lower and kind of similar to what we see in terms of listening to a book on tape. And if we look at things like what happens when the computer system, the navigation system takes you to Home Depot rather than home, you get an increase in the overall level of workload. Frustrating systems that are error-prone tend to really increase the overall level of workload. And then with Siri, this is actually using a hands-free, eyes-free version of Siri where we basically had a little microphone clipped to the shirt, and so someone would basically try and send and receive emails. That was a 4, category 4 on our 5-point scale. We're starting to actually get close to that memory math problem, solving those memory math problems like balancing your checkbook that no one in their right mind would do. So this is with the technology that we saw in our second phase. Our third phase wanted to say, okay, we now know that these systems are fairly difficult for college-age students to deal with. What about people who are older, between the ages of 20 and 70? And we looked to see if, in fact, not only were these difficult, but if I practiced for a while, would I get better? Is the problems that we're seeing mainly because I'm not familiar with using it? So what we did was we brought in people, trained them on how to use the car, then gave them the car for a week and said, go ahead and drive it and practice as much as you can. Come back a week later and let's see exactly how well you're doing. Are you actually still impaired or not? And we looked at 10 different 2015 vehicles, as well as using Apple's Siri, the voice assistants, Google Now, or Microsoft Cortana, to do things like placing calls, music selection, and voice texting. And what we had people do was something like this. They'd be driving along, and at some point this little pink area would say, we want you to tune the radio. So they'd be then using their voice to try and tune the radio. And after they had finished that period, that little pink area where they're actually using their voice to interact with the system, there'd be a little washout period where they're driving without interacting with the car. So they're just driving, but they had been talking and using their voice to communicate with the telematics in the car. And then you might tell someone, I want you to place a call, that pink area. This little blue area is the period where they've finished that voice interaction, and now they're just driving. And so we have situations where they're actively engaged. The IVIS stands for the in-vehicle information systems, who are actually talking to the car. And this blue interval where they've stopped talking, they're now just driving. And the question is, mainly, when they stop talking, how quickly do they return to kind of just the normal baseline driving? And what we see is, here's our single task, that's just driving by itself. Here's our memory math task that no one in their right mind would do. When you're using your voice to talk to the car, talk to these automated systems, to these voice assistant type systems, we see that the workload's almost category 5, almost to the point of doing that balancing your checkbook task that no one would do. We're starting to see technology in the car that's actually really, really distracting. And what we also see is that when you've been talking in the car and then you stop, you don't go back to kind of the baseline level. You're actually still fairly distracted. And there you get this residual switch cost of switching back and forth. And we can measure that by looking at things like, okay, here's our memory math task. Here's just a single task, and how quickly do we go back? After you hang up the phone, in the first 3 seconds, the next 3 seconds, and so forth, you can see that you get a nice curve that says it takes up to 27 seconds after you've hung up the phone before you actually get back to an unimpaired state. One of the reasons why the laws that say that you shouldn't be texting when you get to a traffic light and the light's stopped is because light's red, because when light turns green, while you're still in that period and you start to go, you're in that same period where you're still distracted by the fact you've been talking on the cell phone or texting. You get this kind of a technology hangover. And so that actually turns out to be something that we learned with respect to this. We also looked at, with respect to this thing, the 27-second kind of distraction. We also saw that if you gave people practice, the question is, you buy a car, it's hard to use. You drive for a little while with it, does it get easier to use? A little bit. But what happens is if you bought a car that's hard to use, you're pretty much stuck with a car that's still hard to use a week or a month or a year later. You can't practice a bad interface away. And so if these clunky, cumbersome systems are enabled in the cars, you're kind of out of luck. You're not going to be able to get rid of this. We also looked at what happens with, if you look at what happens as a function of age, looking at college students versus people in their 30s to 50s, and between 50 and 70. And what you see is that there's just an overall slowing of reaction time as you get older. That's just kind of generalized slowing. But when older adults try and use this technology, they're much more distracted by it. It's much more difficult for older adults to use than it was for college students. And ironically, the people who are most likely to be purchasing these vehicles are the people who are in the older category who have the money to be able to buy this technology. You're not going to get a 20-year-old to buy a Tesla, right? Then we looked at, now what happens is we've been focusing our research on the cognitive source of distraction. But most times now when you buy, if a new car, there are multimodal interactions. I mean, push a button, speak a command, information might be displayed on a touch screen. I might reach over and select something. More information might be displayed. So there are these complex multimodal interactions that involve the eyes off the road. So visual demand, where you take your eyes off the road. In many cases, your hands are off the wheel. And also they're mentally demanding. And we know that NHTSA has already kind of come up with visual manual guidelines that say that there are certain kinds of things you ought not do while driving. You shouldn't text while driving. You shouldn't, for example, program navigation systems while driving because they take the eyes and the hands off the road. And our work with AAA helped to create a scale for cognitive distraction. So when we try and look at the kinds of interference that you get and the kind of distractions you get with the kind of vehicle that you would likely buy if you went out right now and bought a 2018 vehicle. Most of the vehicles are equipped with this type of technology. The question is watch out because it's not low levels of distraction, it's not even moderate levels of distraction. More often than not, and I'll show you data that suggests that it's really high levels of distraction, off the chart levels of distraction in terms of impairments from using the technology that you purchased. So we wanted to know in the latest, one of the most recent rounds, the kinds of tasks you can do. Well, I can select music. I can play music with using your voice or touch screen. I can place calls, and all the cars that are available that we've tested support those features. I can send text messages. I can use voice texting to be able to send text messages like I showed with the BMW a little bit earlier. And about 70% of vehicles on the road right now allow you to use voice texting. Or you can actually program destination entry. As I'm driving down the road, I can actually tell the car to try and program the system to basically take me to a particular destination while you're driving. So and about 40% of the vehicles have that kind of capability. And you can actually interact using the touch screen, using your voice, or in some cases, some of the vehicles allow you to kind of a rotary dial and a right pad. And we look to see if the vehicles actually matter. What kind of vehicle? Does it matter? Are all vehicles the same? Or some better than others? And when we look at this, well, there are certain kinds of things that are relatively, on our scale here, we have the tasks. Selecting audio entertainment, calling and dialing, texting, or trying to do some kind of navigation task. And our scale, 0 is just single task driving. 1 on this scale now is the equivalent of doing that memory math task, but for 24 seconds. So no one in the right, imagine balancing your checkbook for 24 seconds while you're driving down the road. That's what that level 1 is. And so you can see that trying to select music and placing a call, well, the good news is it's below 1. But 70% of vehicles allow people to voice text, and that is significantly above that red line. And 40% of the vehicles allow people to program navigation, which is way above it. So it's super difficult to do. This technology is just at the driver's fingertips. There's no user guideline that says, hey, watch out, this is not safe to do. If we look at kind of interactions, it turns out the touch screens, center stack interactions are a little easier in using your voice. And if you have a vehicle that has rotary dials or right pads, it turns out to be very difficult. That turns out to be significantly more demanding. And here's where we see the vehicles. So in this particular case, of the 30 vehicles we tested, only 7 of the vehicles were significantly below that red line. 11 of the vehicles were not significantly different from that red line that basically says, hey, you ought not to do this because it's difficult. And 12 vehicles were significantly above that. So the vehicles, most of the vehicles that if you want, go and buy a vehicle right now, much of the technology is way in excess of the workload that would be reasonable to be doing. Imagine trying to do this memory math task for 40 seconds. That's kind of, in some cases, what we're seeing is that most of the vehicles that score on the extremely high level are allowing complex interactions like trying to program the navigation system while driving, which is something that clearly is specified by NHTSA as something that should not be done. And the last part I want to briefly just tell you about is we look to see, well, the auto industry with the OEMs, those aren't very easy to use, but we have both Apple and their CarPlay system and Google and their Android Auto are systems that are basically designed by software engineers to allow many of the same kinds of features. Question is, are those any easier to use than the kind of things, the systems you buy that come with the original equipment from the auto you buy? And the answer is, it is. So, for example, here, is the overall demand, and what we see is the system that comes with the car is significantly above the red line. Both CarPlay and Android Auto are significantly below for exactly the same kinds of tasks. So the good news is that these software engineered systems that are designed by Apple or Google are much easier to use, lower levels of workload. We see that for overall levels of interference. We see navigation still is difficult to use, but Android Auto with Google Maps is significantly easier. It doesn't take you as often to Home Depot when you want to go home. And CarPlay is a little worse, but both are better than the native system that comes with the car. If you look at things like text messaging, Apple tends to be a little bit easier to use, largely because their voice recognition system tends to be a little better than the Android Auto system. When you're placing calls, the Android Auto and CarPlay, again, are easier than the native systems. That's the good news. And same thing with doing music and music selection. So the good news is that even though the car that you buy today, with the technology that comes with the car when you get it, is likely to be very difficult to use, the good news is the technology that you can use with your phone now at least makes it a lot easier. There are still kinds of activities and tasks that probably shouldn't be done while driving, like programming navigation. But in general, one of the things that's nice about this is these new systems tend to be much easier to use and have lower levels of overall workload and lower levels of distraction potential. So aside from the fact that we had AV issues with audio, which I apologize for, I hope that that's been a little snapshot showing you that the history of distracted driving, the fact that it's been around for a long time, but it's become much more pronounced with the new technologies in a car that are allowing the drivers to do things they ought not do right at the fingertips of the driver. We've seen that, in fact, our brains just simply do not multitask as well as we'd like them to, and so it's a recipe for disaster for trying to multitask while we're driving, and we see that there's a lot of accidents associated with that. And we've also seen the evolution of understanding cognitive and mental distraction. We can benchmark it, we can measure it, we can integrate that with the visual and manual aspects of driving and be able to characterize very clearly how distracting it is to try and use that technology that is coming with your new vehicle. And right now, that technology, for the most part, is very difficult to use. And with that, I'm done.